We have been looking at how Matthew, throughout his gospel, had been looking at the story of Jesus through the eyes of the Old Testament OGs. You know what OG stands for? The old guys, I think that's what it stands for. Anyway, the OGs, the OT, isn't that funny? So Jesus he mirrors these epic stories of what came before. And when we look at the Old Testament stories that we might have grown up listening to, or maybe that we've read recently, and we then look at Jesus' story, there's a whole other layer that can be grasped that we wouldn't have seen before. And we'll be looking at those in Matthew chapter 14 and 15 today. Last Sabbath, we looked at how King David, was a type of Jesus in his storyline, and then we also see how Jesus, the way that he acted, the way he ruled, there's a certain echo back to David in his experience. And then we also looked at how Jesus was called the Son of David, and the Son of David we know was Solomon. And Solomon, he was the wisest man that ever lived, and that way Jesus spoke, people looked at Jesus and said, where did he get this kind of wisdom? How did he know to speak like that? And in fact, they mention his origins. Right at the end of chapter 13, they say, where did he get this wisdom? Because we know where he's from. We know what type of family he's a part of. We know his brothers and his sisters are among us. So where did this guy get this kind of wisdom? So David and Solomon, and then to look after Solomon would come Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was the king that didn't take wisdom, and in fact, because of his very short-sighted, egotistical responses, he divided the kingdom. And then Rehoboam took part of the kingdom, and Jeroboam took the other. And the kingdom was divided from then forward. A very tragic thing in this life history of the children of Israel as a people. And also looking at how Matthew is talking about Jesus here in chapter 14. He begins like this: at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. Now that's a quick piece here, a quick word that we could easily gloss over and move on to the next story, the rest of that story. But it's important to recognize that Matthew said Herod the Tetrarch. And it's interesting, we don't use that word tetrarch today because we don't have that kind of governance in this country, especially. A tetrarch is somebody who rules, but not over the whole kingdom, just over part. So here, Matthew has begun in stating that there's someone that came after, that talked about Jesus being like David, like Solomon, and now he's mentioning a ruler that's over part of the kingdom. So there's these certain echoes from the Old Testament that lines up with this chronology that we've been following Jesus in. Matthew's very intentional here. And it says that about this time, Herod heard of the fame of Jesus. Herod, this was not Herod the Great, this was his son. And this wasn't just, and he had a number of sons, so Herod was more like a title or a family line, you know, this space, the Herods. And Herod, this Herod, the Tetrarch, he married his brother's wife. And that's not cool, right? And it's not cool in Scripture. And John the Baptist was out in the wilderness, and at some point, John made a comment about the morality of the decision of the leader in those days. Now, leaders in those days were different than the leaders we have today. We would hope so. At least legally, then they could do a lot of things just because they felt like it. And we have freedom of speech in our country, But they certainly did not. And John the Baptist, he said, that's not right. That's wrong that Herod took his brother's wife. And it came back to Herod. He didn't like that very much. He took John the Baptist and put him in prison. If you can be in John's mind, he's out preaching, doing God's work, and suddenly he's restricted from doing it. And not because he did something wrong, but because he said something right. And he must have been in prison just in turmoil, thinking, what is going on? And he hears the stories about Jesus. And remember, he sends his disciples, because he knows what he's supposed to expect, but then what he hears is happening is different. And so he doesn't even know if Jesus really is, should we look for you, or is there another that's to come? And while he's there in prison, Herod, it seems there's a lot of space for interpreting what actually went on. And within that space, the commentators on Scripture have made certain comments that they've said that Herod he did respect John the Baptist, but because his name got mixed up in it, he had to do something about it. But with John the Baptist in prison there, in his home, he then would go down and talk to John the Baptist. And he would marvel at John's words, but he also liked him, but at the same time, he was being condemned by him. And all those feelings mixed up together doesn't make a very good brew, right? And so there, John the Baptist is in prison. Herod is putting him in prison, and yet there's some sort of stuff stirring within Herod. And then one day, he's having a great banquet for all of his officials, everyone that is, at least in word, respecting his position. And while he's there, his brother's wife's daughter comes and dances before them. Does this not get more and more weird? Just a lot of it, right? And so she's there dancing before them, and everyone's happy, and everyone's like, oh my goodness, she's beautiful. Oh, it's amazing the skill that she has in dancing. And Herod, and I'm sure he had a little too much to drink, he makes some outlandish statement which shows his generosity and power. So again, ego is all wrapped up in this. And he says to his brother's wife's daughter, I'll give you whatever you want. What do you ask for? And she was prompted, Scripture says, by her mother, Herodias, who had knew this issue with John the Baptist, and he was doing something in Herod's life, and there was stuff stirring, and she didn't like it. She didn't like the words that he was saying about her morality or Herod's morality or what they should or shouldn't be doing. She didn't like this man of God downstairs in the basement or wherever they kept him. She didn't like the situation, and so she prompts her daughter and says, oh, anything, huh? I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Like weird, just when it's just the level it broke. And so her daughter, okay, and she says this in front of all the guests. Now his ego's on the line, his word's on the line, and he says, let it be done. Wow. And the guard goes down, takes off John the Baptist's head, brings it and hands it to her on a platter. The girl gives it to her mother. They don't know what to do. Just, what do you do? And it says that in verse 13, now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. Something happened with Jesus in that space. And in fact, it wasn't just this. We see that the rest of the gospel story, up until the cross, it shifts for Jesus. We've already seen that people have been asking, who is this Jesus? Who is he? And in a few chapters, if you've read ahead, then you'll have seen that Jesus asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? And we'll get there. But here, there's this shift, and Jesus speaks, and people are pushing back. They're accepting him, and then others are pushing back, and there's this tug of war of the image of Jesus. Who is he? What is he about? And do I want anything to do with him? The crowd is asking as they're encountering him in these different spaces. And Jesus, then hearing that his cousin, this man that has been called by God, that he said, is Elijah, if you were to accept that, he's the Elijah that is to come, and he's there in prison. That must have been hard enough. But then for John the Baptist in prison, who must have been praying and asking God, please get me out of here, to then have that be his end, that's the last place that he was. It messed with Jesus. Jesus suffered so much, and we overlook this. Emotionally, spiritually, it was a difficult trial for Jesus. He needed to be alone. And he goes to be alone in a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and had compassion on them and healed their sick. Jesus, emotionally drained, spiritually vexed, he sees people in need, and he steps out from himself, goes and he heals them, he talks to them, he preaches to them, and he gives them hope, he gives them restoration in his own sorrow and pain. What do you do when you're spiritually depressed? When spiritual depression, when emotional just darkness falls on you, what do? Jesus saw their need and he went out to them. That's more than I can say for what I've done at times like that. So the disciples, after they're in that desolate place and all those people are around and Jesus has been telling them certain stories, the disciples come to him and they say, it's late. Send the people away so they can get something to eat. And that makes sense. It does. And if we didn't know the rest of the story, maybe it's the first time you're hearing it, you might say the same thing if you were in that same situation. Because there were 5,000 men plus women and children. That's a lot of people to be in a space, in a desolate place. Where are they going to eat? And Jesus turns to the disciples and says, you give them something to eat. Me? What? All my wages for an entire year couldn't supply enough food for everyone to just have a bite. How are we going to do this? Would the towns around have enough food that we could even buy, even if we had enough money? And they just kept coming up with excuses. And then Jesus, he said, someone comes up and says, well, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Like, that's what we got. And that was an excuse. That was an excuse the disciples were using so they didn't have to act. They said, all we have is 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus. And in the disciples' eyes, they saw an excuse. And in Jesus' eyes, he saw opportunity. Oh, 5 loaves. Oh, I wasn't expecting so many. Bring them over here. 2 fish? 2? Hey, that's great. And he brings them together. He has the disciples have everybody sit down in small groups. And then he raises it, and he blesses it, and he breaks it, and he gives it to the disciples, and the disciples go and give it to all the people. And all that hungry crowd, 5,000 men plus women and children, they go out, they eat, and they're to the full, and that's like stuffing rolls in their pocket kind of full, And even afterwards, there are 12 baskets left over. 12 baskets of food, so much so that they didn't have enough it was just left over. And I think it's interesting, one commentator on this story said, 12 baskets left over one for each one of the disciples that didn't believe that this could happen. I said, where are we going to get this food here for the next time? I don't know what they said. Now, if we were to look through the eyes of the disciples in that moment, just this story, if this was an isolated story like it maybe was presented to you as a kid, this children's story, this simplistic children's story, we might walk away with the image that the moral lesson that Jesus can make anything happen. He can make food multiply so that way you're full. And you think of little lad's lunch, right? That's what I always think of. And it's a simple story, and it's really meaningful, and that's great. But if we picked up on these clues that Matthew has been dropping for those that know all of the stories before, these echoes of what happened before, if the disciples had picked up on those clues about who Jesus was and who he continues to present himself to be, they probably would have had a very different response than the one that they said. Send them away. That was their result. That was their solution to a lot of things. Send them away. Send them away. But Jesus' solution, again, you give them something to eat. If they had noticed some of these things, here, as we read through Matthew's Gospel, we recognize that the story of John the Baptist, just preceding this feeding of the 5,000, we might not question why they come after each other. We might make the assumption, oh, okay, well, maybe they just happened, one right after the other, so Matthew recorded them one right after another. And maybe that's the case. But the clues here, the echoes from the past, would make us think of someone very special when we think about a situation where there's a man that goes to a king and says something that they don't want to hear about their morality and what they're doing. And then there's a pursual later by a woman who makes a threat against that same prophet, if I could say so. We have this story in the Old Testament about Elijah, who goes before Ahab and tells him that because of the way that he's been, his morality and the way that he's been leading the kingdom away from God, there will not be dew or rain until Elijah said so. And then Elijah goes out, there's a big, mountaintop experience, but then afterwards, he's there in front of Ahab's house. And Jezebel sends a messenger out saying, I'm going to make your life gone tomorrow. And he runs in fear. This story of John the Baptist and Herod and Herodias is the same story, just different details. It's the same story, though. And except for Elijah, John the Baptist dies in that situation. And Elijah never dies. There's a deep contrast between the two. And Jesus, recognizing those things, must have been really confused, knowing what God had done in the past, that God had caused Elijah to escape the threats of Jezebel, and then now his cousin dies at the hands of a merciless, evil man. And then to also recognize that with the story of Elijah, he went when he was in need. God sent him to the widow in the woman up in Phoenicia, in Syrophoenicia, up in Sidon. And he's up there with this widow, and God provides for this widow. Remember, there's a bin of flour that's almost out. She and her son are about to die. And she takes that last handful of flour. I mean, so little flour that you have to turn the bin over and bang it, right? And that little bit of dust that comes out, and that handful of flour, and she makes it into a cake. And she and Elijah and her son are able to eat from this. Isn't that amazing? And every single day, there's enough flour for enough cakes for them to eat for that day. This happens for a long time. And then to think about Elisha, the one that follows Elijah, There was a time when he had 100 men there, and a few loaves of bread came in. And they said, what are we going to do? How are all these men going to eat? And Elisha said, everyone will have enough. And he takes and he prays and he breaks and he gives. And everyone eats to their full with some left over. This is in 2 Kings chapter 4. These parallel stories that happened before, that God did before, the disciples knew, but maybe they made excuses. Maybe they said, there's 5,000, that's more than 100, that's more than 3. God can't do it. 5,000, maybe he did it back then, but he doesn't do that today. But didn't they just see Jesus heal? Didn't they just see Jesus multiply the kind of resources in front of them? But yet they have this block. They have this block. We're going to skip through the story of Jesus walking on the water, even though it's a great one, and go down to see chapter 15. The Pharisees and scribes, they come up to Jesus and they have a concern. And we might think, oh, okay, those stories are done, but it's continuing. There's a point that continues for Matthew. And the scribes and Pharisees say, Jesus, why do your disciples eat without washing their hands first? Now, we all know that we're supposed to wash our hands. That's an important thing. But the scribes and Pharisees, these were not medical professionals. These were not health experts. These were not, your mom. This was some religious leaders, some religious conservatives saying, ceremonially, we're supposed to wash our hands. We're supposed to dip our hands into the water before we eat. Because that's what God said to do, and this is the tradition that we've been having for all this time. And then, so they say, so why aren't your disciples, why are they rule breakers? And Jesus whirls around and says, well, then why do you teach people to break the commandments of God? Saying that, well, if you were going to give anything to your parents, you actually will give it to the church, to the temple, and that's better. How is that okay? And so he flips around and says that, and he says, well, Isaiah prophesied of you when he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And then Jesus launches into this other paragraph that we might think these are just things that he said and Matthew's writing it down. But Matthew has a point because Jesus has a point. And he says, you say that the things that enter you are the things that defile you. And they're talking about the unclean meats or food that hasn't been ceremonially prepared in the right way. And so they're talking about putting a certain kind of meat into you, and that's the thing that's going to make you unclean. But Jesus said, no, the thing that comes out of a person is what makes them unclean. It's the things that they do that come out of themselves. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. These are what defiles a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone. Might make him sick, but righteousness-wise, it doesn't affect him. Now, we might again say, well, these stories, I don't really know how to put them together. Well, I guess the first story is about proving that Jesus can make my paycheck last. Maybe he'll provide miraculously some food for me when I'm hungry. Okay, that's the moral I'll take away from that. And I guess it's not what I put into myself when I eat, but it's what I do with that comes, that does, and we might try and put these together, but out of this context of the entire chapter, we're going to miss a few things because this next story comes. This story about a Canaanite woman. It says that Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Does that sound familiar? Wait, to Tyre and Sidon. Behold, a Canaanite woman comes out from that region crying, came out was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely possessed by a demon." And he did not answer her a word. This woman that comes from the same place that this widow that Elijah went to long ago, she comes out to Jesus from that same region. She's labeled here as a Canaanite woman, a woman that comes from the line of the people that were there before the Israelites went up into the land, that they pushed out, that they decimated, and they pushed them out. And she's this a lady that's from outside of God's people, and Jesus doesn't respond. He's sullen. He's stone-faced. There's no response. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, what do you think they said? "Send her away." Again, that's their go-to. "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." You know, when Jesus is around the disciples with the 5,000, and they come to him and say, "Send them away," he wants to see what they're going to do. And he says, "You give them something to eat." They don't remember Elijah. They don't remember Elisha. They don't remember what happened before. They don't remember what happened a few hours before with Jesus healing people. They say, "Oh, well, send them away." That's their excuse. That's their go-to. But Jesus, he says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered her, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." You know, this same Jesus that's responding this way, it feels very uncharacteristic for Jesus to not be compassionate, not be bringing someone in. It feels very, very strange to hear Jesus be so cold to someone in need. But this is the same Jesus that in Matthew chapter 10, when he sent the 12 out, it says in Matthew chapter 10, verse 5, "These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So Jesus had said stuff like this before. Don't go to the Gentiles. And so the disciples, hearing Jesus say, "I'm not sent to the Gentiles. I don't give child's food to dogs," they heard exactly that. There was no pause, there was no hiccup, there was no unsettledness, only the fact that they were annoyed that she kept following after them and shouting out to them. Their annoyance was stronger than any sort of compassion that they could have had. But then she said to Jesus, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. The disciples, having heard Jesus say, "Don't go to the Gentiles" before, probably agreed. It probably resonated really well with their soul and culture. And then hearing Jesus then say to this woman, like, I'm not here for you," they're probably like, "Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. Send her away, Jesus." But then to hear him say, "What great is your faith," they didn't know how to resonate with that. They weren't looking at how God sent Elijah to a woman from the same region. They didn't think about how Elisha was healed Naaman, the enemy of God's people, as he approached them. They couldn't get beyond those boundaries that they had set for so long. And something that I've realized through going through these chapters here is that that's reiterated: God knows no bounds. God's love knows no bounds. But our way of doing things knows nothing but boundaries. What we see are boundaries in just the natural way of living. It's what keeps us safe. It's what keeps us going down a path that we are confident in, knowing who can we accept and who do we reject, how do we love and who do we hate. All these boundaries, this is what we do. We might say, oh, I'm not racist. But then, at the same time, there are certain people in our lives that we've not welcomed into our life, into our space, to have our love and attention. We celebrate when man-made boundaries fall, when man-made, when things that divide fall. We celebrate when wrongful laws, like the Jim Crow laws, when they fall. We celebrate that. As a nation, we've celebrated that fall and those restrictions by looking at Black History Month, which we just finished. We celebrate the fall of the things that divide us, like the Berlin Wall when it fell, the celebration around that kind of separation being torn down. It was something significant. It was something valuable. So we celebrate it. And the disciples could have looked back and seen the action of God in the Old Testament and the actions of Jesus in the New, and they could have learned a lesson, but I don't think they did, even after this Canaanite woman's interaction with Jesus. Because, and I know they didn't, because in verse 32, there's a story of the 4,000. Now, 4,000 is less than 5,000, as though that makes it easier. It's 1,000 less men plus women and children, so it might be easier. But the same situation happens again. Matthew is very intentional about telling both of these stories. And the people have been with Jesus. Actually, now this time for the 4,000, for a few days, they're with Jesus. And Jesus has compassion on them and says, they haven't eaten in a couple days. I wonder if Jesus was just waiting for the disciples to act. And so he doesn't say anything. And then the disciples go, we'll send them away. And then Jesus says, again, you give them something to eat. And their response again is, how could we feed all these people? But the difference here, the 4,000, is that they aren't Jewish people. They're Gentiles. They're foreigners. God obviously did something amazing for the Jewish people that were surrounding Jesus and listening to the stories. Jesus did an amazing miracle in providing for these people from bread and fish. But now, these are not us. These are outsiders. God can't work the same for them. At least in their mind, they couldn't. Jesus again, he has them sit down, and he says, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. They actually had more bread this time. Less people, more bread, and a few small fish. And directing the crowd to sit down, he took the 7 loaves and fish, and having given thanks, he broke them, and he gave the disciples to give to the crowd, and they were all satisfied. 7 baskets left over. Jesus is testing his people still today. He's looking to see what we will do. The same Jesus that spoke before, you give them something to eat. The same Jesus that spoke to the woman, that Syrophoenician Canaanite woman, and says, "Oh, great is your faith." The same God that before was with Elijah and found his servant up in a foreign land when all of his people were against him. That same Jesus in Matthew chapter 28 says, "Go and make disciples of all nations." All nations. And in prophecy, future, we see a time, as Adventists especially, we see in Revelation, this promise that gospel message goes to all nations, tribes, tongues, and people. Every way of describing the divisions that we make between ourselves and another are mentioned there. Does that look limiting? Does that look like Scripture is trying to say, oh, but not these people? The gospel goes out to all people, every type of people, every way of cutting up the pie. It goes to them all. And when considering these two chapters and these stories in conjunction with each other, something that became very apparent to me is that prejudice, in the many forms that we do, prejudice is actually our lack of faith, believing somehow that God has limits like we do. Limits in providing what he's able to do. Limits in power. Limits in goodness of what he's willing to do for people outside of who we think should deserve it. And limits in love. God is greater than the limits that we place on him. Do you believe this? In what ways are we limiting God today? In our church, in our families, in our own lives, our interactions. I heard a poem, 3 points in a poem, right? That's what they say for a good sermon. I heard a poem, and I'd like to read it to you in closing. It's by Wilbur Reese. Maybe you've heard it recently. It reads like this. $3. $3. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. Not enough to explode my soul or disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a cup of warm milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough of him to make me love a black man or pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of the womb, not a new birth. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. It's pretty good. God, we are moved by the actions that you've taken long ago, and we recognize, we glimpse that you are greater than the limits that we placed on you. You are greater than the box we try to cram you into, or the boundaries that we place for you to act. God, your love is so much bigger than we can fathom. And as you wait for us to act with faith and with compassion, remind us who you are. And may we step out and give the people around us something to eat. Thank you for being the God that you are. May we live according to your rules, your commandments, and your love. We ask and pray these things in Jesus' name.